Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that still doesn't know who you have to kill to get fired from this cabinet. Spoiler alert, it's probably Dominic Cummings. And how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yes, I'm good. And I think we're going to plough on, as we have been doing recently, into our headlines. So let's start off first with Scotland. I think people have probably already guessed, if you've been paying attention to the news at all in the UK, you'll have guessed what topic we're going for already. So we'll start off with the Scottish Daily Mail. Chucked on SNP school scrap heap.
Yeah, so our main story tonight is going to focus on exams and the whole fiasco that surrounded it. The first place this started was Scotland, and I'm going to bring this back later, but I think it's really important that this was one of the few crises that the government has faced, both in Scotland and in the UK, where Scotland had to go first. Okay? And by that I mean, if you have a look at the coronavirus response, to which the UK or the government that largely functions for England, Boris Johnson's government, their coronavirus response has been criticised as being quite slow to react and maybe opening up too soon. Scotland have been able to see what England have done at every turn and basically do the same thing, but about 2 weeks later. On exam results, this was the first time that Scotland had to go first. And the results were quite eye-opening. So, essentially what happened up in Scotland is that you're faced with a big crisis during these coronavirus times. Essentially, you have lots of pupils that go to school that need both their GCSE and A-level results. A-level results are particularly important because that will decide who gets to go to university, which is obviously a massive step in any pupil's life. Without A-level results, that you can't just write off the whole year and send them out. So you've got to have some way of grading these pupils. So what Scotland did is they relied on an exam algorithm. This algorithm would take into account people's predicted grades and try and bring the predicted grades that all the teachers submitted into line with what the national average would be for people passing and failing and what grades they'd have over a year. I don't know if you've done any algorithm looking at, Tom, because you're the sciencey one on this podcast, I like to think.
So maybe when we get into the... I suppose, do we want to discuss this now or do we want to discuss this in the UK? Because there was a really good Twitter post that I think was more focused on how it works in the UK.
We'll focus it on the UK then. But essentially the result of the algorithm that the Scottish one did was essentially it said, yay, more pupils overall have passed than on average. However, there was quite a significant amount of pupils that had their pass rates downgraded. So I think it was roughly the teachers' estimates. Here we go in this article I'm reading here. Teachers' estimates were 14 percentage points higher than last year's results. And that meant that about 124,000 results were dropped down a grade when the Scottish governing body for controlling the exam results got involved. They said, no, you've actually been given something higher than we think you predicted. We need to knock you down. That naturally caused outcry amongst a lot of Scottish pupils who were told by their teachers that they're going to get an A and actually ended up with a B. And there's a lot of reasons that I think this feels unfair, but when you do an exam yourself and if you were predicted to get an A and you get a B, you kind of... The control is all within you. You feel you had control over that exam result and you didn't quite perform to your expectation, right? You don't feel necessarily that the exam board was rigged in any particular way. However, in this case, with the amount of people seeing their results downgraded and the way in which the algorithm worked, we'll talk more about this later, but because of the way it tries to average out and because of the way it tries to draw on the results of the previous year, it became quite clear that students who were from poorer backgrounds, more disadvantaged, went to essentially, and as a result, went to schools that had traditionally got lower overall pass rates. Those were the ones that suffered the most because, as with any algorithm, you can talk about the YouTube algorithm or the Google algorithm, how it works. It all kind of works on averages and it will look to reinforce the status quo. So it did disproportionately affect higher performing pupils in lower performing schools. And because of this discrepancy, this led to a lot of controversy. And we can move on to our next headline if you want, but that's where you start to get that backlash against the SNP for the way the exam results went up in Scotland.
The next headline from the Scotsman: embattled Swinney bows to school's outcry.
Yeah, so for those of you not in the know, not that you should be in the know, because to be honest, I had to look him up. John Swinney is the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, and he was the person mainly coming under fire about these exam results. Essentially, the main aim was, how can you have let this go ahead, particularly when it targets the most disadvantaged pupils? And as a result, there became a cry for a vote of no confidence in Swinney from Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem SMPs. The result didn't go through. He kept his position because the SNP were able to convince the Scottish Greens to stay on their side, but only because of the action that Swinney took to try and reverse this decision, which moves us on to our next headline.
The Times SNP support soars despite U-turn over exam result.
Yeah, so the big decision that they took there was to say, we're sorry, we got it wrong. This algorithm, although it's meant to try and be fair, it clearly produced some results that were markedly unfair. Therefore, we're going to allow pupils to stick with their grades that were given to them by their teachers, not by this algorithm. And as a result, the SNP helped to save face on quite a few matters. Although it took a week for this U-turn to happen, people felt that in the end, pupils got the results they deserved. And the point of this headline as well, where it says SNP support soars despite U-turn, this was one of the things that Labour, the Conservatives and Lib Dems up in Scotland all saw as a potential point to really hammer the SNP government. There are Scottish elections next year, May the 6th in 2021, where the SNP are likely to once again take a majority in the Scottish Parliament, which, by the way, is a system that should produce coalition governments, but such is the dominance of the SNP in Scotland, they are still able to maintain a majority up there. This incident was one real example where the SNP had seemed to get it wrong. So the fact that they did a U-turn and tried to get it right was good for the SNP, a bit of a loss for Labour, Lib Dem and Conservatives. But one thing you might have been seeing from, if you're a Scottish Conservative, the first thing I would be doing is getting on the phone to Boris Johnson and Gavin Williamson and saying, hey, we had this problem with our exam results up in Scotland. I think there's a good chance that the same thing could happen in the UK. You might want to think about what you do when these results come out. However, the result was very different, and we'll go on to talk about that in more detail as we look at what happened in the UK. The Education Secretary for the UK government said that the algorithm would deliver credible, strong results for the overwhelming majority of young people, describing it as fair and robust. So, what could go wrong?
So, if those Scottish headlines setting up the kind of background for this story, we're now going to discuss what happened in England, which is obviously a bit closer to home for us. So, the first headline there is the unfair A-level results must be reviewed. And we also have the Telegraph, teachers handed out implausibly high predicted grades, say exam regulator. And then the Guardian, poorest hit by A-level result downgrade. So it seems like, I'm not exactly sure when all those headlines were published, but it very much seems like there was a lot of confusion. And I mean, obviously on the day, there are a lot of people very angry on Twitter, and we're going to go into the details of exactly what happened.
Yeah, so...
But it seems like from that snapshot of headlines, I think that paints a picture, like, as this information was coming out, I don't think it was exactly clear what was happening at the time, and those headlines kind of agree with that in that they all say slightly different things.
There are a variety of headlines here that all paint a slightly different picture. What happened in England was essentially the same as what happened in Scotland. Yes, okay, so, sorry, the results come in for England, and they're essentially the same as what happened in Scotland. However, they've done it to a greater extent. So I mentioned the figure that about 14% of results had been downgraded by a level. In the UK, that number was more than a third of A-level results were downgraded. We're talking 35.6% of people who saw their grades move down one. So if you had an A, you would be getting a B instead. And this, of course, caused a massive knock-on effect for students who thought they would have the results they needed to get into the universities they'd applied for, and suddenly saw themselves being rejected. And there were a couple of horror stories I saw on Twitter of people who predicted AAA getting like BBC or something like that, and that like knockdowns like that can really affect your chances to get, that's the difference between a top level university and one of the more average ones, or might stop you from getting on a medical course completely. And
if you're because for listeners who aren't in the UK, we use the system UCAS, which is our university application system. You apply to, I think it's 5 now, and I think it was 6 when I did it. You apply to a number of universities, and the idea is you pick like your top choice, and then you pick a few other choices that you would like to go to, and then you have like your reserve absolutely bottom place. But before the exam results come out, you've already selected like that ordering, and the universities obviously are trying to give you your first choice, assuming you make your grade. So you can get in the position where if you miss those grades, it's not just, medical courses aside, you can end up have been like, oh, I'm aiming for all the high ones, and then I had like this safe choice in case it was looking bad in the middle of the year. You get to the point where you're going up to the exams, you're pretty buoyed by your predicted grade. You would not pick that backup option, and so then people miss that like they've aimed too high for the lower option, and they've missed all the higher options because of their grades, and then suddenly they're without the possibility of going to uni this year.
Yeah. And then, did you ever never know of people going through clearing and stuff like that? Which is...
Yeah, I had a few friends do clearing, or they did it a third year and then kind of went back with their known grades.
Yeah, clearing is essentially a process in which you can get into a university who still have places available for courses, even if they're, even if it wasn't one of the ones you applied for, you can still go for it. But the process is obviously less reliable than going to a guaranteed university place that you thought you had, provided that you got the grades. And it's just a lot messier. And because of that, you saw, I believe, record numbers of students looking as if they would have to go through clearing in order to get a university place. So, yeah, this was a thing that, obviously affects a lot of pupils. A third of pupils having their results downgraded means that there's quite a big knock-on effect for university entries. Also, it's something that affects nearly everybody. If you're talking about, it affects all parents of children at that age. If a third of them has suddenly gone, oh my goodness, my son or daughter didn't get their predicted grades, and it's not their fault, it's the government's fault, or the way this algorithm works, it's an incredibly bad look for the government itself and how they've operated this procedure of trying to get exam results in COVID, without actually doing the exams. So I think maybe if we talk about how the algorithm worked and why those 2 headlines that I've picked out, both from the Telegraph and the Guardian, are kind of both telling the truth but trying to spin different. They both have their own agendas behind it, right? Because the Guardian is a more left-leaning paper and the Telegraph is one looking to defend the government a bit more.
Yeah. So I think I can't immediately find the Twitter post, but it's probably better if I kind of summarize it and then I can make sure it ends up in the show notes. So there's several things at play here. So let's answer the Telegraph's claim first. The idea that teachers hand out implausibly high predicted grades. Now, I would disagree with that phrasing, but it is true that predicted grades are based on the teacher's impression of you. There is pressure on teachers to have a certain number of A's per class, for example. Like they have percentages they're trying to meet. And then the exams themselves, when you do in a normal year, the exams are graded against a scale to ensure that only the correct percentage, which has been set, of A's are awarded and so on. And obviously, because you can't infinitely split the result numbers, people can end up, as they ensure that number works, that you might get a slight inflation on the actual grade boundary. So that's how you can still get, even with a percentage and roughly the same number of pupils every year, you can still get slightly more people getting an A or something like that. As we've seen over the last few years, like grades are generally creeping up as education gets better. Like even though they're limiting those A's to a certain percentage, like more and more people kind of get caught on that grade boundary is essentially what happens. So the criticism that the Telegraph is trying to level there is the idea. So teachers in general, the pressures on teachers. One, they have to get a certain number of A's. Like they have to. It's both a certain number of A's that they're expected to get for their class, but it'll also be earlier in the year, they'll have all these students and they'll say, well, this student's an A grade student. I'm not worried about them. They're probably going to get an A with very little help. this student's a C grade student, and they're actually, I think, with a bit of hard work, they can get up to a B or maybe even an A, for example. And so they will have to submit those kind of things earlier on in the year to like school management, and that's kind of one of the bars by which teachers are assessed. You know, how value added was what we always called it at my school, and they were quite open about it. Like, you know, this is what you're on now, and this is what we expect you to get when you take your exams. So that's one pressure that's on teachers, which might make them try and suggest, like the argument here being that that there is a pressure there for them to maybe suggest a higher grade than is possible. Although obviously if they don't meet those grade expectations, like it's not as simple as that, because if they don't meet those grade expectations, well then they're a bad teacher by this definition. So it's not so simple to say that they're always trying to inflate the grades, because they're not. They're trying to be accurate and also hopefully help some kids out who are struggling. You know, they're like basically they're going to focus less on the A and A star students because they're probably fine. Whereas it's the lower grade students who need the help to get up a grade.
Yeah, certainly. And I think the Telegraph's comment was also like it's a bit barbed as well. It's trying to pin the blame on teachers, and, you know, simply said it's like, oh, well, if they didn't grade them so high, then they wouldn't just be disappointed. People shouldn't, you know, inflate people's expectations. And it's like, nah, actually, like, no, this is just what teachers have to do.
Yeah, I think maybe some nuance being lost in what I'm saying. I 100% agree that teachers are trying to do the best job there, and that I'm just trying to state that there are these two pressures, but realistically, a teacher gets awarded for doing a good job where they increase. In fact, if anything, from some teachers I've spoken to, you're slightly better off predicting slightly lower, and then your results look better when the students actually put in the work and end up the grade above.
Yes.
Because then you've done a better... You said, I'm going to achieve this, and actually I've achieved more than this. So actually it's kind of almost the inverse. But I definitely heard people saying on the day, oh, well, teachers know their students. Like, teachers are bad at grading their own students because they want them to do well. And I can definitely understand that there is a bit of... like, I'm not saying there's no truth to that statement. Teachers do want their students to do well, but I don't think it's a systemic problem to the tune of 30% of all kids. Like, I think that's the difference. Like,
yeah.
Maybe there is a teacher out there who predicted higher because they thought the kid's going to do well. You know, stuff happens. You know, you could have a relative die, and then that can affect you. That's why there are things in place with the exam boards to handle major life events, because someone who's promising could like have a load of revision wiped out because one of their parents is really ill, for example. So yeah, again, any headline is going to be too simplistic. But I think possibly more interesting we can get into the algorithm itself, because I think we can mostly dismiss the Telegraph's opinion there, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to point, I wasn't having a go at you. I was pointing it out that somebody could read that, not look into it deeply, and think that teachers are giving C students A grades because lol, they'll get away with it this year, which is not the case at all. And I think you've done a very good job of describing why I don't think that is the case. The more interesting part of this story is probably the next claim from the Guardian that we've got in there, isn't it? Which is, what was that headline again? Sorry.
So the Guardian said, poorest hit by A-level result downgrades. And it seems like this is, firstly, it seems like this is factually accurate. That is just true. Now, why is it true is the more interesting question. And there is, I'm hopefully going to be able to find it again to put in the show notes. There was a very good 10-post Twitter thread about this.
I saw the same one, and it really helps to break it down if you can find it. It's excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I'll throw it in the show notes, but I can summarize without having it immediately in front of me. The basic idea. So firstly, we don't know the details of this algorithm. We haven't seen the code. It's not open source. So this is all guesswork. Is the one thing I will caveat this with. But it seems to line up with what's happened. I mean, bits of it are just things that happen when you're binning data into buckets. And then there is a bit of extrapolation involved. But basically, the idea being, so the algorithm, I think we're pretty certain, based on what people have said, that the algorithm took into account, I think it was the last 3 years of school results from your particular school. And so we have, the result we want is correct grades. The inputs we have are the predicted grades for that student, the number of students in a class, how well their school has done overall, like in the last few years, and we can take an average of that. And therefore you can work out like percentages of how well these kids are going to do. So that sounds like a really sensible basic idea. We say, on average, this school has done this well over the last few years, and you maybe weight the last year a bit more effectively because schools can vary from year to year, and if they're on the up and up, that trend is probably, you can assume, is going to continue. You wouldn't want to downgrade based on that. So you have your class, say it's 20 students, and you're getting, I think it's 5% A's and so 5% A and A stars, and then there's they've kind of done these bins of grades, and so you essentially say, here's all the predicted scores for this class, and we need to map those to the nationwide scale. So if you say, well, so the first thought is you'd say, well, we just do percentages across the board, right? So you say we've got 20 students, of which 5% are getting A stars and A's. Well, then you take in those predicted grades and you go, well, this looks like a normal class that fits that national average, and you just say those top. In
a class of 20, it would be one student would get an A. Yeah.
Single student. So that student can get an A or an A star because it's a 5% limit. Sorry, yes, that was just a second where I did some math. And then the next group of students would get B's and C's and so on based on these percentages. But that's too simplistic. Someone said that's just too simple. You can't just split that. And I think you could see an obvious problem is if you have a small class, like 3 music students, it would be very unfair on that final student because that first student is 33%. So they've actually taken up all the A's, the B's and the C's, which pushes that second student into a D, even if they're an A grade student.
And weren't teachers also asked to rank the student, not only give them predicted grades, but rank them in terms of ability? Is that how they were forcing them into these bins in the first place?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So it's like you take your 20 students and you number them 1 to 20, and so the best student in the class gets the A star, and so on. So in that example, you'd have 1 A star per group of 20 students.
Even if you feel that a quarter of your class are actually operating at an A level, only one would get the A.
Yeah. So so say it's traditional, right, to have maths sets in the UK and English sets at least. Most other subjects there aren't enough students taking them, but at least in those subjects you tend to have sets. So your top set, you would assume, are mostly going to get A's and A stars, maybe 1 or 2 B's, because you've selected for that. So if you were doing it on a purely classroom basis, you can immediately see if you're doing it based on percentages, that just wouldn't work if you're doing it based on classes. So that's why this is a bit of a false example, just to prove the point, because obviously the whole year group would be taken into account. So you'd basically rank that year group. And also there's a bit of technicality in the fact that people take different maths exams because you have intermediate and higher maths, but that's probably going into too much detail. And so that's the first problem, is if you could imagine an arbitrarily small class size, say 3 people taking music at a school that has only just started their music department, for example, then those 3 kids, well, that final kid would actually probably get a U because they wouldn't. I think they'd get a D or an E was in the example used, because the first 2 students have taken up 66% of the class because it's not mapping directly because you're doing it based on percentages. So that's one problem you can have. And then the additional problem is that this is based on the school average. So a lot of the problems that we're seeing, and the reason why it's poorest hit here, is I don't think it's a surprising statement to anyone, and I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that people who go to private schools tend to get better grades because there is more time and investment put into their education, regardless of how good they are to start with. Like, if you throw the best tutors at anyone, you can teach people tricks to pass exams as well, but better funded schools lead to better grades as a general rule. So if you're taking this average in a private school where you're expecting the last 3 years that you've had really nice results, most people getting A's and B's, A stars, A's and B's, well, then the algorithm is doing something in the background here that is saying, actually, well, no, we're not just doing this simple percentage thing that I've just described. We're going to skew that based on the results that we have from the last few years. So in a school that mostly gets A's and A stars for a particular subject, it's going to assume that a larger percentage of people will get A's and A stars. And someone on the boundary might still get affected by this issue because you still have that problem of doing people by percentages. And I think it's been pointed out with several people, you will never get a perfect algorithm for this. So there's always going to be someone on those edge cases who might get caught out. But the thing is, if you're in a class of 20 where they're expecting 16 A's and A stars, for example, because it comes from a good school, well, then that that student at the lower end might only get bumped down to a B or a C, as opposed to being bumped down to an E. And also, the majority of the students in that class are going to be happy because they're going to get what they expected. When you have schools which are in deprived areas or have not, or just even a state school compared to a private school that has less funding, there's obviously lots more pressures on both the kids and the teachers, because they, less resources, just essentially whatever it is, less books, less money, don't have as nice lunches. So, the kids fall asleep in class. There are so many different things that a disadvantaged school that can affect the student's learning process. But say one of those schools is being turned around and it's on an upward trajectory. Well, averaging over the last 3 years, there might be 2 bad years and only a good year. So then your average still assumes that this group of 20 is going to get, say, 10% A's instead of the 15% that is now true because there's been some investment recently or they've got a new teaching method or whatever it is. So that's one problem. And the other problem you get that is the problem that I think has been the worst thing is it's when there's 1 or 2 exceptional kids in a year who are way above the average that their school has had in previous years and are therefore outliers, they're assuming, say, this school's only going to get B's and C's. So that kid who's an A-star kid coming from a disadvantaged background, the whole kind of idea of like, you can move up in society by being clever and smart that we're all told. Well, that kid gets graded down because, their predicted grade can't be right because their school's only ever got B's and C's. But that ignores that individual story. And I think that's the main point here is that the algorithm is trying to do a thing and it will be imperfect. And it's really these kind of edge cases. It's these kids who are like, well, no one in my family ever went to university. I'm the first kid who's going to go to Oxford. I'm the first kid who's going to go do a medical degree from my family because I've been, I've done really well in my GCSEs, I'm doing really well in my A-levels. And then the algorithm just didn't take into account those factors and downgraded them like 2 or 3. And especially as we're talking for things like medicine, if you're on A star A B for your medicine entry and then you get downgraded to like B, C, D, that's going to seriously affect your chances, if not stop you getting into medical school entirely, which is one of the problems we said. And I think we're going to discuss more about the medical school stuff later. But yeah, I think that's kind of that's the best overview I can give. I will try and get hold of that tweet thread to put in because it went into way more detail and explained that better than I did.
Yeah, so you've hit the nail on the head exactly there. And particularly at the end, I'm like I said, you're the sciencey guy. I don't feel I'm as sciencey, but the optics of this were absolutely awful for the government. This cold, unfeeling algorithm handing out results to lower than expected results to students from disadvantaged backgrounds is a really poor look for the government, particularly when I think most conservatives would say that they are for therefore, being able to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and advance, under your own, it's about how much effort and work you put in. It shouldn't be about the background that you're from. The Conservatives would advocate for a meritocracy. The fact that this algorithm was working against it clearly upset people. And what happened next is that you get this big outcry, particularly from pupils, but from parents as well, stating that the results they've been given were fundamentally unfair.
So I think that leads us into our next headlines. So we had the Metro, pupils force exams U-turn. And then we had the Mirror, this is no way to run a country.
Yeah, so those headlines in particular, so the Metro, pupils force exams U-turn, that word U-turn, we've been talking about it for a couple of episodes now on the amount that the government has had to do. This was another in a long line of U-turns that Boris Johnson has been forced to put in place when government policy has clearly been wrong or led to a result that they either didn't intend or didn't think about. And I think it's that sort of anger that's led to the Mirror's headline of this is no way to run a country, because it appears at the moment on issues of competence, the UK government, the government led by Boris Johnson, is, failing at a lot of things. I can't remember if it was last episode we mentioned this, but, the UK has been proved to have not only the largest level of excess deaths in the European Union, thanks to COVID, but it also has one of the worst economic fallouts, which suggests that we got the worst of both worlds. Having this sort of exam thing on top makes everybody look incredibly incompetent. There's no friendly way to put it, unfortunately. And there was a growing frustration amongst not only Labour voters who you'd expect to be unhappy at the government, but also Conservative voters thinking, oh, somebody really should, what is happening in Boris Johnson's cabinet, what's happening in the upper echelons of government that's leading to so many errors. And I think this is where we get onto the other big issue that this whole exams fiasco has caused. I mean, one, I'm glad that the exam results did force a U-turn and that pupils got the results that they deserved. This has had a couple of knock-on effects, I think, but mainly in the case of, if 1/3 of results were downgraded and now they've all been put up again, universities are struggling to fit all of the pupils into the places that they said that they could go into, because usually universities plan for at least some pupils not to reach those grades. And I know you said you were going to mention medical students. What was your point there, Tom? Sorry, I don't think I picked up on
research. Unlike with other subjects where it's entirely up to the universities, and again, talking about incentives, there is an incentive for universities to take on more students because then they get more money. And I know this, like when I went to university, my year, there was a bumper year at my university, and actually a lot of students had to go and live in accommodation that was rented from another university because they couldn't fit everyone in to their first choice of accommodation because they were oversubscribed that year. And now they've built more accommodation on campus, but like they had to have that year or two where students were coming in and they didn't actually have anywhere to house them in order to like pay for the building that would later house more students. There's definitely some perverse incentives going on in academia based on like getting students in. And I know obviously like this year is already going to be interesting because I think they were saying they were expecting about 80% of home students to come this year and not defer by a year, given the current situation. And I think it might be even more, something like 50% for international students, just because, I mean, if you really wanted to go to university, I think you go, oh, well, I'm going to quarantine for 2 weeks. Fine, I'll turn up 2 weeks early. Like, there'll be some kind of way of doing it. If you're an international student and your parents can afford the fees, you can likely afford to stay in a hotel for 2 weeks so that you can do your university. But there's definitely, some reticence to come, especially as you say, the UK has been dropping the ball quite a bit on COVID, so you could see why people would not want to visit. But the specific thing with medical students is that there is a cap on the number of people who can take a medical degree. And I believe Gavin Williamson, who we're going to get to in a moment, has had to say, I'm raising the cap this year to because of this. So essentially, loads of people weren't going to get in. They then, as you say, undid that, which now means more people are actually qualifying for medical school, and all the medical schools were like, we can't take half of you, sorry. And then that's now been fixed. But as you say, it's constantly been kind of going back on various things.
Yeah. And yeah, particularly when there were, before this U-turn happened, there were days of the government saying, no, we're going to stick with the algorithm. No, we're going to stick with these results. As always, some U-turns can be quite embarrassing for people. As I mentioned, Scotland had to do one before as well, and that's been embarrassing for the SNP. But as the Times suggested, it looks like they've been able to get away with it. The UK government, I don't think, has been so lucky.
So I mentioned Gavin Williamson. Do we want to talk about him more in depth? I think we have, from the Mail, we have the headline, "The Man Who Won't Take the Blame." And I shared earlier with you a Room Next Door from Michael Spicer, where he's taking the mick out of his performance on Sky News. And then the Times, Williamson was warned about risk of exams fiasco, because I think one of the big things the government claimed was that, well, we kind of found out at the weekend, like it was only when Scotland had its issues that we were suddenly trying to backpedal, but actually they were warned in June, I think it was, by Ofqual.
Yeah, they were warned. Yeah, they were warned months before that this might be an issue, or they might see the sort of results that would lead to poorer pupils being disadvantaged, for example. And to see that in June and nod your head and go, yeah, that's probably fine, carry on, is certainly a very bad look for the government. Also, equally, like I said, as you mentioned, the fact that Scotland had gone through exactly the same thing, and the government had a whole week to see the reaction of Scottish parents, the enforced U-turn and what they had to do. The fact that they thought that they could just keep their head down and get away with the same thing and not have to backtrack was astounding to me. There's also the fact that Gavin Williamson, it was revealed today in a news story that he'd gone on holiday a day before the A-level results came in, which kind of means when you're the press or you're looking for people to have a comment on the results that have just come in, you would usually go to your education secretary. So to have him effectively running away and unavailable for comment is very embarrassing for the government, and again raises a question of how competent they are. So it's been another fiasco for the government where I think where there appears to be a very clear chain where the minister involved knew of the potential impact, they had the chance to act in a different way and chose inaction or chose the wrong decision. We've been talking about this with the government's response to COVID, which has also affected people's, I think, interpretation of how competent the government has been. This was yet another straw on that camel, and we just need to see how many straws get put on before you break that camel's back. The other fact is that you've got papers like The Mail, who are very, very traditionally, supporters of the government, once again hammering one of the members of Boris Johnson's cabinet and essentially calling for him to resign. There have been multiple ways that Williamson has tried to deflect the blame, most notably trying to say that, hey, well, Ofqual was pretty much involved in this as well. Maybe you should look at them. Tactics like the Telegraph maybe trying to force it onto teachers and saying that they're the ones who overgraded students. But I do think at large that's been an excuse that hasn't been accepted by the general public. A lot of people seem to put the blame at Williamson's door, and well, for the time being, I think it's not going away, or at least it hasn't. And one of the reasons it hasn't is because Boris Johnson, who would also be a man to come out and back his cabinet member, has also been missing, and that has led to a multitude of headlines. I haven't included them here because there were just so many, but if you get a chance to go to Sutton Nick Tumblr, the one that we use for researching these UK headlines, there are lots, particularly from the Daily Star, that depict Boris as the invisible man, and Gavin Williamson as a clown. There is another Mail one which puts that depicts Boris Johnson and Gavin Williamson as as Laurel and Hardy, basically saying this is another fine mess you've got us into. There's a big backlash between people who would usually, I would say, support the government come what may, particularly when we've had a press that's been very divided on Brexit lines. It's been very odd recently to see papers like the Mail going against the government, and you're suddenly shocked and going, oh yeah, they can criticize the government when they've done something that's so blatantly wrong.
Before we move on from Gavin Williamson to maybe discuss a bit more the Conservatives in general, you posted some YouGov polls. So obviously these are individual polls, limited polls, but still it's kind of does give us a bit of a barometer of what people think. So do you think the UK government have handled the situation regarding people's exam results well or badly? And that's an overwhelming 75% say they handled it badly, with 19% don't know. So, I mean, it seems like 19% of people aren't really paying attention to the news or feel uninformed on this particular issue. But the fact that only 6 people think they handled it well, 6 people. So the fact that only 6% of people think they handled it well, I think is very telling.
Yeah, it's something where I think the polling backs up some of my claims. I try to be as fair and balanced as I can on issues where there's a bit of 50-50 in it. But I feel this was an issue where both public opinion and my view line up in the fact that it was clearly a mistake by the government and they did the right thing with the U-turn. The fact that decision maybe came a bit late was the biggest query. Also, just going back to that one, who do you blame, the government or Ofqual? I think it is right to say that Ofqual has had a role in this, but ultimately it's that question of where does the buck stop? If Gavin Williamson was informed in early July by Ofqual that we've come up with this algorithm, but it will act in this way, he's ultimately the person who has to sign that off and agree with it. He can he has the option then to turn back to Ofqual and say, no, that's not good enough. We're going to have to come up with a better solution than this. The fact that he didn't and then defended the algorithm until it became untenable suggests that there's either a problem in Gavin Williams' judgment or his competence as a cabinet minister. So yeah, I think that's why a lot of people are calling on him to resign. The fact that he hasn't yet, and he probably won't, again, is another question that we'll probably go on to discuss, and it was one picked up at the start of the show with that joke. We've seen many mistakes by many ministers over the past few months, and not a single person has resigned or seemed to face any consequences for their actions. And that is something that I think ebbs away at public confidence in the government, to see, what exactly do you have to do to get removed from the government? How incompetent do you have to be?
Well, I suppose that's probably my next question then. We have touched on this a bit in our previous episodes, but yeah, exactly. What does someone have to do to be sacked from the cabinet now? Because I think we've had several clear examples this year of things that would have got someone sacked in a more normal year or under a different government.
I think the only thing that would get you sacked is speaking up against Boris Johnson and disloyalty. That would be the thing, because this is a cabinet, as I've said before, rewards loyalty, and if you stay loyal to Boris Johnson, you'll keep your job. It also might be a bit of a worry for the government that I don't know if they feel that they've got the talent pool underneath the current members to recruit into those spaces, or have people that they trust enough in the recent Conservative intake that they think are going to toe the party line. I mentioned this in a personal... there were people just discussing politics in our Facebook group the other day, and people were talking about what a mess the cabinet was, and the only person who's come out of it well is Sunak. That was the one person I think I just pointed out and said, he's done a good job. One, he's been given all the lovely, nice messages to tell people, such as, hey, we're going to give you money and furlough until October, and hey, have a meal on me. It's fine. So one, he's going to come out of that, smelling of roses. But two, he's one of the few cabinet ministers who wasn't promoted on loyalty. He just kind of stepped into Javid's shoes when he was fired by Dominic Cummings and team for refusing to follow their new way of how they were going to run the Treasury Department. So he was kind of a junior that was like, yep, this is my one chance at being a cabinet minister, I'm going to take it, but wasn't necessarily a Johnson loyalist before that. So I think that is also striking, that it takes somebody who's had to come outside of that bubble to appear the most competent. But it's odd that the Johnson administration doesn't know where to turn next. And I think one of the reasons they refuse to sack or let ministers resign is that they don't know who to replace them with and who's going to do a good job for them. There have been several calls, even from the Telegraph and Conservative papers, saying that Johnson has a chance to reshuffle his cabinet after the summer recess and after then they come back in August. But they all believe that he'll probably just stick with the same deck, which in my view would be a big mistake. I think people would welcome a shake-up and, some consequences for the actions of people who seem to not be performing well in their job. You'd expect it in any other place of work. Why not in the highest levels of our government? Seems baffling to me. But hey, I'm not Boris Johnson, thankfully.
Yeah. Speaking of Boris, who I know we touched on briefly, he was away camping and therefore was seen as the invisible man. I don't know if we have much more to say on that specifically, but what other problems are on the horizon? Because apparently kids are going back to school in, a week?
Yeah, one of the tweets that was doing the rounds, that was from Gavin Williamson himself, was saying, I have two priorities over this summer. One is to make sure your students get the exam results they deserve, and two, it's to get your children back into school safely. And a lot of people were going, well, you really messed the first one up. I'm not so confident about the second. Also, just to go back to Boris Johnson, who was camping in a yurt in Scotland, which led to another great Twitter post I saw, which was control the virus, save lives, stay in a yurt. He was also quite angry that the Daily Mail revealed where he was staying, because it forced him to abandon his holiday early for security concerns, because people can work out where he actually was staying. But anyway, this has led to Boris Johnson having to come back into the fray and try and take the lead on schools. Just today, we've seen him start to hit the front pages saying pupils will go back to school in September. There's been a big push from people like Chris Whitty and other coronavirus scientist talking heads talking about how there's very little the risks of students. Sorry, let me get this right. I believe it was Whitty who said that there's a far greater risk to children missing school at this very important developmental stage of their lives than there is, compared to the risk of them catching coronavirus and, having adverse effects from that. So there does seem to be a big government push to get education back on the agenda, but try and make it a positive thing of students going back to schools and trying to push the exam stuff to one side. And on that, it appears that Boris Johnson is trying to take a personal lead on that matter. But I don't know if that will succeed, particularly when he seems to have been hiding away from the bad stuff for so long. He was on holiday. Everybody deserves a holiday. I saw a lot of people saying, well, sorry, not a lot of people. I saw people on Twitter, particularly Robert Colville, who used to write for The Telegraph. I believe he writes freelance at the moment. But one of his points was that if you're Boris Johnson and you've just had to deal with a big COVID outbreak, go into intensive care with the disease, and also have the birth of your first child, you probably deserve a holiday. And that's right, everybody deserves a holiday at some point. My counterpoint to that was that when you have a crisis to this extent and you're the sodding prime minister, you should probably go off holiday knowing that you can, take a break later in the year. You probably need to put your country first at that stage. So, yeah, it's been another poor week for Boris Johnson. I haven't brought the links for the polls that I saw, but in particular, there is a feeling that this issue has hit the government in polls, particularly where you're seeing leaders like Keir Starmer outperform Boris Johnson on, when they're looking at how competent a government is. Labour are still trailing the Conservatives in the polls, but that gap again is still narrowing. So, yeah, overall, another fiasco for the government and for the Conservative Party. I don't know how many more of these they can take before people really start to before these start to have an effect long term. I was thinking about this during the week. There's lots of things you can do as a government that affect your polls rating or how people view you, and a lot of those can be political, right? Let's take Brexit as an example. You either like Brexit or you don't like Brexit, and that's going to affect how you view your political leader. But the one thing that really sticks with people and can turn people off your party, even if you agree with them politically, is the issue of competence. If the government keeps showing that they are incompetent and incapable of leading, that will lead people to say eventually, look, I may support your Brexit policy, but you're unable to get basic things done. You're unable to govern as a party. I'm afraid I'm going to have to vote for the other guys, so I think we'll at least enact maybe part of your agenda, or at least do a good job of running the country. I don't think that the Conservatives have yet, in their current administration, proven themselves to be a safe pair of hands on anything. I don't know, is that being unfair? I can't. Maybe that's my own internal biases going on there, but yes, I don't think many people would look back on this administration and say, yeah, you appear to do a lot of things well, given the number of U-turns and backsteps they've been forced into over the past 6 months.
Yeah. And I think just continuing our story from our previous, last few episodes, it's almost like a comedy of errors at this point.
Yeah. It's just, what will they mess up next? Find out next in our next exciting episode of Unparliamentary Language.
So we're going to have a brief break now just to advertise one of the other shows on the network.
Hi. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took the schoolyard conversation of which one of my favourite fictional characters would win in a fight? Well, wonder no more. Join me, Chris, and my co-host Matt every other Sunday for Mish Mayhem, and you can find out.
So I think we're going to move on into our quick polls update. So we're going to go over the pond to America, and you have posted a shiny new link now that we're now kind of in the run-up to the election. I know we've been talking about it for about 3 months because we needed something to talk about and we didn't have a general election on the horizon. But this is now, there is a new shiny page which currently says Biden is favoured to win the election and has, am I right in thinking this is a variety of different, this is like the Gaussian curve of different vote possibilities. So there's 6 options where Trump wins and 16 where Biden wins. So this is based on various input parameters.
Yeah, if you scroll down on this fancy page on 538, which is one of my more trusted websites for going to, predicting exam results, they also have an algorithm. I know I've been slagging off algorithms for a lot of the time, but the fact this is an algorithm that's used to predict something, but the actual result on the day will be made by real human beings voting, which is nice. We don't do elections by algorithm, thankfully. It's got lots of different graphs and great visual representations of the percentages of how much Trump's going to win or Biden's favoured to win. So if you scroll down, if you've got the Trump wins 27 in 100, can you see that graph.
Yes,
there.
with some rather amusing cartoon faces of both Trump and Biden, which I like. It's a bit it's kind of cartoony in an endearing way because there's a little fox who's teaching you about how the statistics work. It's there to be as accessible as possible, and I approve of that.
So the text here: we simulate the election outcome 40,000 times to see who wins the most option. The sample of 100 outcomes below gives you a good idea of the range of scenarios that our models thinks is possible. So you've got everything from Trump winning with 384 electoral votes to Biden's 154, or in a super Biden scenario, Biden wins by 513 and Trump picks up only 25 results. That's like really unlikely to happen, and there's a lot of things along the curve. And as our friendly fox says there by the side, don't count the underdog out. Upset wins are surprising, but not impossible. Just like that cartoon you sent me the other day, Tom, where it was the difference between election predictions and sports predictions.
Yeah.
Do you remember? Where it's like, what was it? No, it was something along the lines of like, if somebody says, "Oh, we're the favoured to go into the sports match," and the favoured team loses, you shrug your shoulders and go, "Oh, well, that's unlucky. Maybe next time." But if somebody tells you there's a 51% chance of Biden winning and he doesn't win, Trump wins, people will be furious at that outcome. How did the algorithm get this wrong? How could you betray me like this? There's obviously a lot more fire behind those. So, yeah, the link will be in our show links. Go to it. I think it has some really great graphs and way of sort of seeing US elections in particular. There's a lot of information that you have to calculate, and sometimes you want to know where you should put your attention on more. If you scroll like sort of down to the bottom, the winding path to victory graph, the snake diagram, shows you a visual representation of all the states in America, where the tipping point is to get 270 electoral votes, and ranks those from the places that are most likely to vote Democrat to those most likely to vote Republican based on the current polls. So you can see what the tipping point states are and what the crucial ones are. So from this election map, I can see that Florida at the moment is one that if Biden was to win, not only would it get him a huge chunk of electoral votes, it's also one of those ones that is the tipping point state, which means if he wins it, then that's going to be hugely significant on the night. And particularly because Florida is on the East Coast, that's an earlier result, fingers crossed, 2000 election, excluding that, because that was obviously incredibly close between Gore and Bush, and that caused a very late count, a very late result on that time. But yeah, that's you can see which states to look out for on the night and to see which way the wind is blowing. In 2016, of course, 538 predicted Hillary would win, but their win predictor very quickly went towards Trump when those early states where they said this is kind of a toss-up, when Trump was winning certain states that they'd thought would go Democrat, then suddenly you can see the winds changing. They go, oh, blimey, if we see this result repeated across the country, then we can expect a Trump win by this much in the Electoral College, and that's what's happened. So, yeah, I just really wanted to point out that part of the 538 website and for something to, observe in the coming days, because newsflash, I know this won't be true of the time that this podcast is published, but as of the 24th of August, there are exactly 71 days until election happens in the US. So 2 and a bit months. That seems insanely close now.
That is much closer than it was in my head, even though I think my problem is I always think it's end of November, because once the elections happen and everything has gone through, it takes so long for the actual president to get into office. It's like, it's quite different to how we do it here, where it's just like, next day, new prime minister, there he is, number 10, So, yeah, it is kind of surprising to me it's so close, because it's earlier in November than I remember. That's because they have Thanksgiving and things in the way. The other thing I'd just like to draw attention to on that thing you shared is at the bottom, very bottom, they have states with the closest races, and then obviously you can also switch that to states close to the tipping point. And at the very top, there's a national overview, but you can go into, say, New Mexico, and then it shows you what they expect is going to happen. So they're saying New Mexico is a state to watch, but it's down as 91 in 100 chance of Biden at the moment. And then it links to the actual polls influencing their forecast as well. So there's so much information in there for you to dig into. But yeah, I think go and have a play with that page. I don't think we're going to summarize much more, but at the moment it looks good for Biden. But as you say, 2 months, I mean, a week is a long time in politics. 2 months, something could happen.
There's a lot to go, and probably like in the next few episodes, we've had the Democratic National Congress, the Republican National Congress is going on now. Those tend to be traditionally they're big focus points for people in America to suddenly go, oh yeah, there's an election happening. This is real. Now it's the first time where the candidates are like officially nominated for their names to go on the ballot. I know they've had loads of primaries, and we've known for a long time now who's going to actually be on the ballot. But the fact that that's like the official starting gun, this is the time where we will see campaign ads go more. I know Trump's done a huge push on YouTube in the US. We'll talk more about Trump's strategy in a later episode, but that's been quite interesting to watch. And yeah, debates. We'll have actual presidential debates to talk about, that's going to be an episode in itself. I'm sorry, I need to get out of my... make it known how much I love the drama of a presidential debate and the significance they can have or have had in previous elections. Sometimes we sort of overplay them, but they are good points, like good focusing points where candidates' true feelings are laid bare for the world to see. It can, on occasion, make or break your campaign.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that will be great to dive into. And I mean, it's not like we have a general election coming up anytime soon. I think we're going to definitely get plenty of time to talk about the race as we run up to it, as we like to do. And then obviously our coverage of the US will drop off a bit after the election. Just before I go into the usual kind of outro stuff, just to say this will be our last episode of this season. And then our next episode of the new season will be very soon, because we just haven't had the time this summer to go into our usual kind of interesting deep dives, which are a lot of fun, but involve a fair amount of prep. And every time we've kind of got halfway to getting one ready, like I've got a document I've been throwing notes into, then we've suddenly been sidelined by the actual news. So I think we'll probably just try and sprinkle specials throughout the next season, but our seasons try and line up with UK Parliament. So I think, am I right in thinking they're roughly on line with the school programme, or do they go back later in September?
No, they're roughly on line with the school programme. I think, yeah, we usually do silly season, and I don't know if you've noticed, but things haven't been silly really recently.
Unfortunately, it's been serious season all year long.
Exactly. So, yeah, actual news has happened. This is another reason why, sorry, boring tangent, I'll be really quick. That's why the exam thing took everybody by surprise. Everybody was on holiday. It's meant to be silly season. These things aren't meant to matter. The fact that you can cock something up so spectacularly when everybody's meant to be on holiday is yet another reason why this government's level of competence should be brought into question.
As always, Rob, thank you for joining me and giving your insights. We are available in all the usual places. Go to parliamentary.observer, which will take you to our website, where you can obviously listen to the podcast, but you're already listening to this, so you don't need to know that. You'll also find you can come and comment on our episodes. You can find links to all the other places where you can find us and discuss with us, whether that be Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, etc. You can also find the episodes on YouTube if you want. And of course, if you can support us in any way, there's patreon.com/TTSS, where you can support any of the shows from the network. And of course, you can come join us on Discord, listen to us recording, chat with us in here, do all the things. Or do one of those things. Like and subscribe, share it with people. That, all the things people say. Spread the podcast if you like it. The best thing, as I say, is always, an actual recommendation to a friend to go listen to it is always going to be more effective than just like clicking a like button somewhere. But yeah, I mean, it's always nice to have more people listening to the podcast. And with that, I don't think I have anything else to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.